So we're going to, Be'ez Hashem, get a little deeper into the understanding what the idea of bias is. I'll be pshat, I'll be soid, I'll be earnest, to understand a little bit, to bring everything together. And talk a little bit about what particularly makes a home, what is the definition of a home, and what does it mean to have Yiddish a home? What does it mean to have a truly home of Kiddush? What does it actually mean to create that space? So we'll start off, which we talked a little bit about yesterday, which is Brisa, which is Brisa in Gemara Shabbos Chafalef. Gemara says, Torah Balam, Mitzvah's Hanukkah is Ner Ishu Beisai. The basic mitzvah of Ner Hanukkah, which means the basic mitzvah, not Mahadin, the basic mitzvah is Ner Ishu Beisai. Which means a house, a flame for each person in his household. Now, of course, the word Beisai in this context doesn't necessarily mean Beisai, literally a home. L'chora, you could say that. It means more the household. Now, you should basically, the household has to have one. So if you belong to a household, like we mentioned yesterday, there's certain poskim that hold that if you belong to a certain household, you're a child in a home, even though you're not home, technically, you can be yotz the mitzvah with the lighting that's done in your house. However, if you look a little deeper, you'll see that it seems that it's also a din, a law that's particularly connected actually to the house. Because if you open up a Rambam in Hilchos Hanukkah, in Perek Daled, Aleph, which is the first, Perek Gimel is the first introduction to the Hilchos Hanukkah. Perek Daled is already the halachas of Hilchos Hanukkah, particularly to Hanukkah, not to Halal. So the Rambam writes like this: Mitzvah sheyiyah kol Bayis u'Bayis madlik ner echad. The mitzvah is that every house, and here Bayis doesn't refer to household. We're actually talking about Bayis, literally a home. The mitzvah is that it should be for every home you should light madlik ner echad. And then there's mahader. If a person is doing more hidur, is madlik ner is minyan abayis. Then you light according to the minyan abayis. So if there's 2 people home, you light 2 candles. 3 people, you light 3. Mahadrin, if you do extra mahadrin, then you add to the mahader. According to the Rambam, this is another machlokes thing. The Rambam and the Ramah, even the Ramah generally passing like the Rambam, which is a chiddush because it passing like the Rambam, like Teves, because Teves said mahadrin is only on the ikar adin, and the Rambam holds that it's on the mahader. But according to the Rambam, you'd only do one. The head of the household will light one and then light a few for each person, then continue lighting. And our custom, which is in Ashkenaz, is that every single person lights and every person continues to add. So it's something that's connected specifically to the bias. A mitzvah called bias or bias, the mitzvah dafka on the bias. Not only is it a mitzvah on the bias, but there's also a particular location within the bias. Where's the particular location within the bias? So generally, the mitzvah is a Pesach base machutz, that you should light the candle, that it's on the Pesach base towards on the opening of the home, to the door of the home, b'machutz. Now, therefore, the din of Rav Huna. Rav Huna said, "Amar Rav Huna, chatzir shlebeis psachim." Let's say if you have a chatzir out the Pesach base and machutz, you have 2 doors. So the halacha is that you should light on each ner l'chol Pesach. You should light a candle for each door. Why? Because of Shad. Because of Achshad. This is what the Gemara says later on in Shabbos Chavimah. And that's the way the Allah is. The Allah is we have to light a candle on technically in each door. This is interesting because just to draw a little bit of a slight parallel to this idea, this halacha, is if a person is not allowed to be shachan ra, you're not allowed to walk past the shul when the shul is in the middle of davening. But if you're not going to walk by the door of the shul, but if there's another shul in town, and there's another shul further down the block, then there's not the halacha. So there you're not worried for the chad, because if the person's not going in this shul, he'll probably go to another shul. But over here, you don't say that. Because if you see one door in the home doesn't have a menorah, you don't say, oh, probably in the other door has a menorah. But you have to light each door. So it seems that it's a stronger idea connected to the kavu of the home. A person is a mahalach, so you can say that, okay, the person is walking. Where he's walking, he doesn't know, so he's probably going to the other place. Here, it's something connected specifically to the bias, almost like a kavua, that there's something in the bias itself. The bias itself has to have a ner, and a ner at each Pesach. So we see something that is connected, that it has to be to the bias. Of course, when it says that it has to be connected to the Bayis, that the Hanukkah, the candles in Hanukkah has to be connected to the Bayis, of course it means a Bayis shador ba'adam. Or is mezuzah chayvus adar, chayvus abayis, chayvus adar, is it chiyuv on a house or on a person? But clearly, we're not talking about a house that doesn't belong to a Jew, doesn't have a person living there. Certainly, that house doesn't have a chiyuv. There's no chiyuv on a chefza. There's no chiyuv on a chefza. The chiyuv is on a gavin. The chiyuv is on a person. When there's a person living in the bayis, when Yid's living in the bayis, then there's a chiyuv on a Yid. It's from the structure, from an actual bayis to a beis dira. That's the idea of Hanukkah that we see in general. This is the principle of the halachic idea, that it's connected to bias. And this is really a Pleish. The Pleish writes in Daf Chofalov, the Pleish writes that the din, where it says an Eisher Bayis that has to be a Pesach Bayis Malchut, the Pleish says that it's a din in Pesum Nisa. And we learned this also in the Teves and Sukkot we quoted, the Teves and Sukkot Daf which Teves asks the question, why don't we do a Birchas Haroya? Why do we do a Birchas Haroya? When you see a candle, why do you make a bracha of Sha'asa Niskin while you don't do this on a lulav? So Teves gives two reasons. One is because mitzvah chaviva, like mitzvah Hanukkah is mitzvah chaviva on Martin. That's a special mitzvah, chavivim di b'soifim, the special chavivas of that mitzvah. And the second reason is because there's kama b'nei adam she'ein lahem batim, ve'im yadam l'kayim mitzvah. It means literal, there's kama people that don't have a house, and therefore they can't be Mekayim the mitzvah. This clearly ceased to be a din in the bias. And this is not just a theory, but this is actually the halacha. Gathered very recently, I bought the Mincha Shloimeh, I was reading this right before Hanukkah, and I saw this is so he's on the Lashon Rambam, and he writes, Mavur, the mitzvah lach chayvus al adam ladika dafki v'beisoi. Or Pesach HaChatzer, but dafki v'beisoi. V'chein kosses v'Rambam, v'chein kosses v'Toisus, and he brings on the Rambam, brings the Toisus, and the Pnei Yeshua, and that's what he passed him. And then Shalom Orbach has a long tshuva to Daled. Doesn't need to be a real bias, or it could be even a place that you're spending a little bit of time. You bring the raya from Achsanya or from Beis HaKnesses, that it doesn't necessarily have to be a real bias. Certainly, the idea is that it's certainly connected to the idea of a bias. This is clearly Shem Zalman Orbach learns this Gemara, that it's connected to the bias. So it doesn't mean that it's a chiv on the bias. Of course, it's a chiv on the gavra in the bias, the person that's in the bias. Why dafka in the bias? So back to a little bit to understand what is gather, what is when we say a bias, when we say a home, what does it mean a home? So in the Gemara that we learn, there's different definitions of the idea of a bias. In all the definitions we can find the clarity of this. Lagabe dine ervin, with regards to laws of ervin, with regards to laws of where you can go, which is where you can travel. So that's a machlokes the Gemara brings down in ervin, based on Gimel, the machlokes of Rav and Shmuel. Is that Rav holds as Malkum Pita, it's the place where you eat. Wherever you eat, that constitutes the place that becomes your bias. Shmuel holds that it's a din in Dafka Malkum Lina, the place that you sleep. La Lacha, you do Allah Rabbi Surah, you pass like Rav, that it's Malkum Pita, but that's a din in Erevin, like the Pasuk say, that it's specifically regards to Erevin with regards to Shabbos and the meals of Shabbos, how far you have to walk to have a meal. But it has to, that's why it has Malkum Pita. We see that a home means a place that you spend time in. What's the definition of quality time? Quality time means where you can spread yourself out, and you can enjoy your meal. This is what it is. And how big does this place have to be? So, like we learned in the Gemara Sukkot of Gimel, Gemara says that a bias, in order to create a bias, it has to be a daled al daled. Why daled al? Because that's chazal there. When a place is daled al daled, you can mispash it, you can spread yourself out, you can open it, you can be. This is a place that you can mispash it. This will be considered a diras kva. Of course, the diras arai, which would be sukkah, has a different dinner. You know, daled al daled, but the idea of a diras kva means at least you have daled al daled. How high does it have to be? Again, there's a height. It's a little strange, the height, because it has to be at least Yutfachim, and the Gemara about the comment, Aleph says, also that's the definition of Chazal. Also, in order to have a bias, so we're just going to the dimension of the bias. It has to be a certain width and length, has to be a certain height. It also has to have a tikra. It has to have a roof. In order for something to be considered a bias, it must have a roof over its head. and without that, it's not considered a bias. In fact, one of the Dorim, and according to the Rambam, you would actually one of the Asar Tanoim, one of the Asar Tanoim to have a thing has to have a tikra. If it doesn't, it's not considered a bias. Okay, then it's a difference of beisecha v'shkecha. Maybe in a shar you don't need a tikra, but if it's beisecha, it must have a roof. If it doesn't have a roof, that's already not considered a private a bias. According to the Rambam, the only two tanoim that you need to have a Rosh Hashanah to create a public space is a chiddush. The Rambam in Perik Yudal Lachal, the Rambam writes only two things. First of all, you need Tazayin Amos. You need 16 hours of people who walk a bigger space, and it should be Einim Makur. It should not have a roof. The Rambam does not mention the idea of Shishin Riboy. It has to have 600,000 according to Shitz Rambam. Even though in Stam and the Gemara, it seems that when Yidden were in the Midbar, it was considered Saram because the Midbar could be a karma or not. So the Gemara says this is when Jews were in the Midbar or not. So it seems to be that when the Yidden were in the Midbar, the Shishin Midbar, that's considered Saram. But the Rambam wants to fakir that Gemara, or Rambam and the Rambam is a truth for that. And he says that actually when the Yidden were in Shishin Midbar, it was actually not Rosh Hashanah. There were people too connected there, so it's Rosh Hashanah. Anyways, but the idea of a tikra makes something of Rosh Hashanah. Tikra is when you have a roof, so you have walls, you have a roof, you have height, and you have width. This is all. This what does that do when you have a space that has dal, and it has a tikra? This creates a protective space, which means now you're protected in this space. That's what happens. And therefore, you could be mispashit. You can extend yourself in this space, and this is why the idea of dalad has to do with also with the idea of the measurement of a person, and therefore dalad is kindness of b'chol which is a rabbi, that the idea of dalad means that the person's expansion, where a person expands himself, and this is also this idea of the four levels nefesh ruach machaya and the whole idea of where a person is mispashet, the place of his bias. That's a kol moshe. The bias in Adam, like it says, even though the Gemara says kol moshe. In Adam, we talked about this again. The bias, because places means a bias. It means that that's the place that a person is mispashet. So this is all what we think about a bias. However, in order for this structure to actually become a bias, it needs one other element. It's not enough that it has walls, and not enough that it has a roof. It's not enough that it has a certain amount of height. It's not enough a certain width and length. It has to also have a door. Without a door, now you could say, okay, without a door, how could you get into the house? That's not the shaila. Okay, so krich through the roof, fix krich through the chimney. The shaila is in halacha, in the gather of bias, we call a house something that doesn't have a door. So there's a Gemara, we'll see soon in a second. There's a famous Gemara to Yachim. So the Gemara says, that it's all and build big palaces on the property of this ger, of this convert, that didn't leave any yoshim, and then another person comes along and makes a delos. It's kana acher, and the second person has a opinion. Why? Because the Gemara says it's living ba'alma. He's just putting up bricks in Velteran. Ba'alma means nothing. In order, this is the Allah. This is the Allah that if you put the doors on the structure, you are the one that yarshins this space. So there's something about the doors, and then there's also the halacha in the Rambam in mezuzah perik v'olach. The Rambam says that so tanoim yesher bayis. There are 10 tanoim for a bayis, and then with these 10 tanoim, this house becomes a home. We have a mechuyev in mezuzah, there's a chiv in mezuzah, and he says v'yila dalsis. It has to have doors. Without doors, there's no chiv in mezuzah. There are tainas that it's not. You can do without doors. It's a haksir, but the Rambam holds clearly that it actually needs doors. In la halacha there, simreish pevov, the Mechaber Tezvav writes like this, that generally without doors is chayiv, like the shittas haravid yesh mishapoiter, which is shittas harambam. Why? What's the svara? What's the svara about benichse ager? And what's the svara that the Rambam holds that basar tanoim is that you actually need doors. What's the concept of the door that you say without the door, it's not considered a bayis, it's not considered a home? So there's a Rakashavar. The Rakashavar writes this in a few places, and one of them he writes that conceptually the idea of a house, there's two ideas. One is the actual structure of a home, the physical structure of the walls, the dimensions, the roof, the ceiling. That's one thing. And then there's the tsura, the conceptual idea of a home. You could say it a little different, the difference between a bayis and a dira. That in order for something to be transformed, or it's not even transformed, in order for something to truly be a home, not just a structure, we'll see what that means, it actually needs a door. The door, or the doorpost, or the place of the door is what creates the tsura of what a home is. Now, of course, a kol dir she'en b'dirin is ein a dira, but the tsura of the house actually happens particularly through the doors. So it becomes a dira instead of just a bayis, a structure. It becomes a dira. The dira na, it doesn't say zoichel bayis na, it says zoichel dira na. Dira na is a diuk. It's not just a bayis na, a nice house, but a dira na, which means the tsura. If you're zoyer in the mezuzah, which is the doorpost, if you make the doorpost, if you mark the doorpost, then your house is transformed from just a physical structure, which we can call a bayis, to a tsura of a bayis. A tsura of a bayis. That's why the Gemara talks about is marchivin daita shaladim is a dirana, the idea of a dirana. Learn the Ksav of Kabbalah and Chazal, when we talk about a batim or bayis, batim, it doesn't necessarily mean a home where a person is living. It means simply something that's makabel something else, something that's receiving something else. It's like a bayis would be a box, a container. That's the definition of a bayis. It's not the tsuras habayis, but the basic bayis. I don't know if I'm giving this language, these two definitions. The definition of a bayis versus a dira. It's not the Rakashava's definition, but he calls it the tsuras habayis. This is the regular bayis. You say bayis. What's a bayis? A bayis is a box. A box means that it has walls, it has a ceiling, and it has a roof. Okay, how you get into the box? I don't know. Smash the door, smash open the roof and get in. But that's the definition of a bayis. But that's one definition. But in order for it to become a dira, in order to become a tsuras habayis, you actually need a delas, which is different than the bayis itself. There's a Meshech Chochmah. The Meshech Chochmah in Shmois Lamed Zayin Aleph writes that in the psukim in the Torah, wherever we find an idea of a bayis, or in Chazal when we find the idea of a bayis, at the bas the bottom lasis ashulchan, the Torah talks about the idea of the bottom. He says the definition of a bayis in the Torah is something that's makabel something else, which means it receives something else, but it's not receiving it in a permanent. But if that thing exists within that thing, and sometimes it exists outside. In other words, it's like a container. Sometimes it exists in the container. Sometimes it exists out of the container. That transforms it from just a box into a bayis. This is what Meshech Chochmah says, and this is why in the Torah you'll find whenever the Torah uses the word button, it's always to an object that sometimes is in that box and sometimes is out of that box. So let's take this Meshech Chochmah to understand this a little bit more b'oimek. If we're translating the idea of a bayis not just as a physical structure that's holding something, but it's a place we're saying that in order for something to become a bayis, it means something that goes in and goes out. Then in order for it to be a real bayis for a human being, definition that it really becomes a bayis, it becomes a dira. In order for it to become a dira, it's not only that we can walk in and out of that, right? If you have a structure of a box, and it has walls and it has a ceiling and it has a floor, and theoretically somehow you can get into that, or someone builds around you a structure, and the structure and the structure has walls and has a floor, has a ground, and it has a ceiling, and you're protected in that, and you're in there. Is that considered a bayis? No, that's not considered a bayis. It doesn't have the tsuras of bayis because it doesn't have the delas. Because just like what the Meshech Chochmah is saying, it needs to go in and out. It's even more ba'oimik. It's not just going out. The definition of a bayis is in the place where there's the in and out movement. The definition of what creates a physical structure, what makes a structure into a home, into a dira, is precisely in the place, in the makim, where there's that movement from where the yoytz of nichnas, where you can actually go in and out. Dafka in the place, specifically in the place of the Pesach, where you can leave and you can come in. That's where where there's the chi of the mezuzah. That's where the place of this of a physical structure actually becomes a tsuras habayis. Not just that you're having mechitzas. There's a gather of mechitzas l'tznius. We learn in the Shabbos and the Shmira to protect yourself. You're closing off yourself from listim or chayes rois baderech. There's wild animals or other things. You're closing yourself from the elements. Okay, that's just you're fortifying yourself from everything else, or you're protecting yourself in the way of tznius that you're not being observed by the other things. So that's just the bias itself, the actual physical structure. But in order to actually become a deer of in and out, and this is the idea of that a bias, one of the first button that we have is actually the oil of Avram, which is the idea of there's a achnasas orchim. What is the idea of achnasas orchim? Achnasas orchim is that your bias is open, your door is open. Now the door can also be closed. That's going to be a choice, but it's the opening and movement of outwards and in for yourself and for others. So it's not the definition of a bias is not just a place that it's I need to protect myself, so therefore I create a bias. I surround myself with this structure, and this structure contains me, and therefore I'm protected. You say, no, that's not a bias. That's not considered yet a dira. In order for the dira, you need a delis. And what does the delis do? The delis not only allows me to leave and to come in, but also allows other people to leave and come in. And it's a controlled environment. I can say what can come in, what can come out, what comes in, what goes out. But there's a level of fluidity that it's not stuck. Whatever's in the bias is not self-contained. There's some type of movement outward and some type of drawing inwards. You machnis the orchim, the oirach, the paths of the outside world in, and you project from the inside world of your bias to the outside. There's a Gemara. The Gemara says, it's interesting. Gemara appears. It says it a few times in Shas that bias is command miladami. That the Gemara in Erev, the Gemara in Shabbos, and Ayvov, the Gemara says that a house is like compact, is full. The Gemara in Shabbos talks about this, and Tzadik Zayin talks about this idea of, if you're mavir reshus ram reshus be'emtza, and if it's makura, so it's as if it passed over something that's solid because it's compacted. So it's interesting that Rashi in Daf Hey writes in Shabbos, it's as if it's filled up. The whole house is filled. But there's a lashon in Shabbos Tzadik Zayin that Rashi writes that because it's dark and filled with hevel, filled with breath or atmosphere or something like that. It's a very mystical Rashi. I'm not sure what Rashi is trying to say, but somehow Yesh Leimer, the Rashi said hevel in there, and it has a lot of thing. It's a stuffy place. Let's say it's a stuffy place. Not just with chafetzim, not just only the chafetzim filled it with the objects in there, but it becomes a stuffy place. Well, how do you undo the stuffy place? You actually need a delis. Well, what the delis does is the delis allows for this movement, that it's not just a selfish a house is not just a place. You say a house is man's fortress, that it's a place that I protect myself against the environments, against what's against me. So I surround myself with this self-contained container, and therefore I'm protected from the world. No, that's not really what a Yiddish home is. A home, the definition of the tzuras habayis, is a bayis that has a pesach, that is pasuach liyotzim v'nechnasim, and then it becomes a true definition of a bayis. So it's the place specifically in that transitional place where things from the outside come in, things from the inside go out. In that fluid, porous place is where that creates the place where there is. That's the definition of the bias, and that's why interesting. The first time we have in the Torah where it talks about the idea of a bias. Where's the first time of a bias? Not Avram Yitzchak Yaakov, but really a bias. Where Yidden are becoming Klal Yisrael is the birth of Klal Yisrael. So where do we see the bias? It's dafka by the bias of Korban Pesach. That's the first time we have the Jewish home. And how's the Jewish home marked? How's the house of the Ish Yisraeli marked in Mitzrayim? Dafka al Pesach, dafka mezuzah al mashkef. It's not marked in the inside. There's something about marking that that liminal space or that transitional space where you're moving outward and the outward is moving inward. That's what the Torah says. There, over there, place of the Pesach. That's where it shows up the tzura of light, etc. But it's not mamish a place that people can walk in. Even halacha, even if there's a window and someone decides to walk at the window, it's patam and a mezuzah. It's not a place it's not a pesuach place. It's not the place where the derech, normal place of moving in and out. You know, the Gemara says in Psachim, that you have to do something. There's a cloud god of Torah, a general principle in Torah. Also for Leisa, also for Essay, when you do something, the Torah wants you to do something. It says you have to eat something or do something. You have to do it in the correct manner. This is the derech. It's derech on the sharim is not a derech. When Torah says you have to, there's a rocket shabbat that says that you don't have to say Tfilas HaDerech if you fly on a plane, because it's not derech. It's not the derech. It's Tfilas Drachim. It's not Tfilas Drachim. It's derech Hashemayim Nikra. It's a derech Shemayim. It's not derech Haaretz. Something's not the right derech. It's not considered the derech. Anyways, the idea is dafka specifically at the place of the door. Now, Kiman the Milyadami, that it's just filled and compacted. It's not about self, but there's some type of relationship to the outside world that you're allowing what you want to receive from the outside to enter in. Your machlis orchim, and also you project outward. That's where the tzura of a home, of the tzura of a dir Yisraelis. That's where the place where it's marked. Now, where's the Bayis? And then we'll get a little bit to Hanukkah to understand how this works in Hanukkah also. That the Bayis Ikri in this world, at least in times of the Beis Hamikdash time, was obviously the Beis Hamikdash. That the idea of the Beis Hamikdash is mamish like a bias. So if you think about a bias, what is a bias? So you would say, what's the definition of bias? Before we get to the whole Dalsis idea of bias, but this is the basic definition of a bias. The bias is to protect whatever is inside, to make sure whatever is contained within this box is protected from the outside elements. So this is the Gemara. The Gemara says also in Psachim. Chavav, the Gemara talks about the Me'ilah. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai Soimech al Heichel v'Doyrish. Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai used to Soimech on the Heichel, so lean on the Heichel Mikdash, and used because of the shade. And he was Doyrish. The Gemara talks about it. If it's a problem, but the lashon of the Gemara says that it's not a problem because Shani Heichel the Lefnim Hava Asur. That the Heichel, the objective of the walls of the Heichel was to protect everything what's in the inside. So it's sort of the bias is to protect the inside. That's on one hand. On the other hand, we have another Gemara, also the Gemara in Shabbos, which talks about the Hilchos Hanukkah. The Gemara says that they used to light the menorah, they used to light the Hanukkah, the Ner of the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash. And the Gemara says, is it possible that Hashem needs a light? Was that the reason that it was lit? No, the Gemara says it was the idea, it was to tell everyone that the Shechina was Shruya. That means that the Beis Hamikdash is like a home. On one hand, it's to contain it's lefnim. It's also lefnim. It's for everything that's contained within this space. But the whole idea was that it's shkuf matum, and that it was to project light to the outside. That's what it says when you go to Oile Regel, which Oile Regel is like a form. It's like a form of achnasas archim. The Eibush is achnasas archim. Hashem is machnas orach when you Oile Regel, because it says kishem shabal liros, just like a person came to liros. The Gemara Chagiga at the beginning of Chagiga says just like you come to kachak liros. That there's a symbiotic relationship. The Eibush wants to see you, the heroes. You should be seen by Hashem, which means that you're entering Hashem's presence. You're not just going. It's like when you're machnas oirach, when you're bringing in a guest. There's two people that are enjoying this relationship. One is the balabas. So the balabas is feeding the other person or giving them shelter. Okay, that's one level. That's one level from the top down, so to speak. That's one level from the inside to the outside. But then there's also from the outside to the inside. And Hashem says, I actually I want to see you. I want to be machnas you into my bias. I want to see you. So that's the idea of drawing inside. So therefore, when there is no Beis Hamikdash, when we don't have Beis Hamikdash, so therefore Ner Hanukkah al Pesach Beisim Bachutz. Let's go this a little bit deeper. When it talks about Hanukkah, so in the Nusach of Al Anisim it says that Achar Habo v'Necha l'Dvir Beisecha. So what's Achar Habo v'Necha l'Dvir Beisecha? What's Dvir Beisecha? Where do we have this language of Dvir Beisecha? Why is Beis Hamikdash called a dvir beisecha, and dafka bonecha is a dvir beisecha, lashon chvivos, that it's a bonin come to the dvir beisecha. This language is also found in Shmon Esrei by the Avodah. The lashon avodah the dvir beisecha. So the Avodah says the dvir beisecha is the place where there's Ashas Hashchina, the Dvar Hashem, the Ashas Hanavua is Navi, is Slasayim, that's the place Hashem speaks to Klal Yisrael. It's also Kibesi Veistil L'Cholamim, that's the place that we come to daven, which means that's the place where there's a Pesach. Now, this is not a Pesach and a Delos in a physical form, but there's a Pesach of the mouth. That's the place that we come to speak to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. From our outside, we come speaking to the inside of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kaviyachol. And that's a place at Dvir B'Secha where HaKadosh Baruch Hu's inside is coming to speak to us. That's the place of the dialogue, Kaviyachol, where there's the inside and the outside are connecting. This is that connection is represented by that place of that transitional place, by the Pesach. So the Gemara says, the Gemara in Pesachim says that like Avram Shekasa by heart. The Gemara talks about the Beis Hamikdash, and it says that in the Beis Hamikdash we find different phrases how the Beis Hamikdash was called. That's the Beis Hamikdash was called by Avram Avinu. The Makam Hamikdash was called Har, was called a mountain, and like Yitzchak is called a sada, it's called a field, which is so Avram is higher, Lamaila, and Yitzchak is Dafke Makam Acharisha, Dafke Lamatan, the place of lower, higher and lower. Yitzchak and Yaakov, Eliki Yaakov, that the Beis Hamikdash will be called like Yaakov. Which the Makam HaMikdash will be called Bayis. That it's called a Bayis. It's called a Bayis. Now, what is the Bayis? The Bayis, in general, so we saw like the Ksava Kabbalah, the basic definition of a Bayis, before we get to the whole lumnus of Arkachava about the Dallas of the doors. What's the basic structure of a Bayis? A Bayis means a place that contains. If something is contained within that thing becomes a Bayis. So it's very structured and centered. And you put something in there, that's considered a Bayis. But if you look at the Nevuah in the dream, where Yaakov had this dream of, we said, what does the Eibush tell him by that particular Nevuah? That you're going to be poirets, you're going to spread throughout the entire world. And the different Gemara says, the Gemara in Shabbos, Kufitah says, on the Anigas of Shabbos, Zoichel Nachla Bli Mitzarim. A Nachla Bli Mitzarim. That if you're ma'anikas a Shabbos, if you enjoy Shabbos and you have real oinik Shabbos, which oinik Shabbos really in the deepest level is infinite, is bli gvul, then you're zoichel and nachla bli mitzarim. You're zoichel, you merit to have a nachla, an inheritance bli mitzarim without agbalas. So on one hand, Yaakov is called Bayis. Bayis means dafka structure. On the other hand, dafka the Bayis, dafka the structure is nachla bli mitzarim, is a structure without boundaries. What does that mean? Where do we see that in a Bayis? Because a Bayis is definitely a structure. The Yad Hashem Hiskel have to be exactly the Beis Hamikdash have to be. There was an opening in the Pesuach that people were able to la'alis l'rois, able to enter, people exited, and this going in and out, the yotzim and nichnas, elected outward, and also received inward. The Eibush wanted to be laharis. The Eibush wanted to be that we should be seen. We should offer karbonos. We should go into his house, and his house should be spread throughout the entire world. That's really what a Bayis is. This is a Bayis. And simply also, when we talk about more conceptual idea of Bayis, that idea, which we're not going to get into, but the idea of let's say, base Malchus David, or even base Chashmonoi, the idea of a Bayis, what's together of a Melech, and Klal Lev actually receives all its nutrients from everything in the body, but distributes also the blood throughout the body. So there's an in and out movement, there's a Yotzev and Nichnas. That's the whole idea of a base, or the Melech, to give and to receive. And this is the Beis Hamikdash. And Be'emes, this is not only the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim, this is the Beis Hamikdash aprati of every single Yid. That on one hand, the Bayis is created, the walls of the Bayis are created, sneakers, of course, it's Makom Lina, and it's Makom Pita, so Makom Pita, it has these sneakers and these shmira, it's protecting you. But in order for it to actually become a true dira, in order for it to be nicknamed as a dira, and it should become a home, it actually needs a Pesach, and needs a Pesach that's Pesuach. It needs an often a home. Often a home, I don't know how to translate this in English, but an open house, often, a breita home, a wide home. A home, yes, you know what comes in, what comes out, but it should be a place that it's open. Now, this is what a home is, and really the oimik is that the home, like we learned yesterday, that the Gemara says in Megillah Chavtes, the Gemara says that a sidim batak nesis batak midrash shababavel, that it would oil Eretz Yisrael. So we learned from the Kedushas Levi that he writes that it's not only batak nesis, but it's certainly the homes of Klal Yisrael, because if the batak nesis, which is only a place that we do a few mitzvahs, kol shekain a home that has many mitzvahs. But let's go a little deeper. The Marsha on that Gemara says like this. There's a medrash. It's not in one of the enforcing the midrashim. There's a psikta, something that's similar to this, but it quotes some Shem medrash, that it says that a siddur Eretz Yisrael should dispashet b'chol ha'aratzos. In the future, Eretz Yisrael will dispashet on the entire world. I think I wrote this in one of my slides. Okay. And a siddur Yerushalayim, a siddur Beis Hamikdash should dispashet b'chol Yerushalayim. And eventually, the Beis Hamikdash will dispashet b'chol Yerushalayim. Says the Marsha that what does that mean? Why is the whole Yerushalayim come to the Beis Hamikdash? He says because the Gemara says that a seed the bottom to see the bottom of the Midrash Shabbat, because the bottom to see the bottom of the Midrash Shabbat will eventually to Yerushalayim. So he says that will actually become part of the Beis Hamikdash. The bottom to see the bottom of the Midrash will become part of the Beis Hamikdash. So therefore, the lashon of the Mashal is like this: V'nimtza ata begolus shana oime the Beis Hakneses harehu makim hamikdash gufa del asid lavei. Now, when you're standing in a shul, because the shul will become part of the Beis Hamikdash, when a person is standing in shul, you should know that you're standing actually in the Beis Hamikdash. On that, Chacham Sofer in Drashas Beis writes a Gevaldik thing. He says this. He brings on this Gemara. He's like, "Show you something like this." In Leila Seder, when a person does a Seder, the kedusha of the Seder certainly transforms your home to kedusha Beis Hakneses, Beis Hamikdash, and we can use the Kedushas Levi, and it's even a kol shekeh. It's certainly. So what does that mean? That b'pnimis this actually means that when you're standing in your home, in your house, and you have a Bayis that's a ruya l'shem dira, a zoyer b'mezuzah, you're zoyer in the mezuzah, not just in the physical mezuzah, but in the mezuzahs, in the Pesach and the dalsais, you're zoyer to have an open home that you're machnas oirech. You shut out things that you don't want to come into the house. You allow things from the inside to penetrate into the outside world of the choshech. If you have that relationship and your home is Beis Hamikdash, gufa del asid lavei. When you're standing in your home, you're actually standing in a chelik of the Beis Hamikdash. It's not just a theoretical idea. It's mamish. Your house is a part of the Beis Hamikdash del asid lavei. And now we can understand a little bit more. One last step. We can understand a little more why Nes the Hanukkah Neir is a dafka al Pesach Beisim b'chutz. Dafka like the shit is around, the shit is a toises, and we said the shit the correct. If we make our house into a true dira, our home actually becomes a chelik of the Beis Hamikdash. One of the ideas of Hanukkah. What is Hanukkah? Hanukkah is not only a Hanukkah mizbeach of Beis Hamikdash that happened thousands of years, but Hanukkah, it says in the Chassidus Svarim, Hanukkah is also a chinuch with lasid. It's a me'ain of the gilui of the Oiragonas. So therefore, when in the times of Beis Hamikdash, there's a very strange thing about Hanukkah, which some of the poskim, later poskim talk about. Things that are more aware on this, that they talk about this. There's a problem because the Gemara says, when the Gemara talks about Nes Hanukkah, it says Tanah Rabbanan, the famous Bayis. The Gemara says that there was a famous story of Hanukkah. The Shana Acheres Kavum, the Shana Acheres, and the next year Kavum Mahalal Beidah. It says the next year they established the days for Halal and Hoidah. To sing Halal and to say Hoidah. Hoidah is and Alanis. This is the two mitzvahs. So much so that Halal is a chelik of Hanukkah. That Hilchas Hanukkah is Peir Gimel. Now Hilchas is Peir Gimel. Hilchas Hanukkah is, according to the Rambam, is Hilchas Halal. That's what the Rambam writes Hilchas Halal in the laws of Hanukkah. That's Halal Beidah. But where does it say that they established to light the menorah? This is one thing. Another thing, interesting thing is the machlokes in B'Shamai Hillel, Kiyadua, the doing Shaila machlokes in B'Shamai Hillel, of how do you light candles? Do you light, according to B'Shamai, that you light 8, 9, 10, you go lower, or do you constantly progress higher? This is the machlokes. So the Shaila is B'Shamai Hillel lived after the Churban. Towards the end of the Churban, but B'Shamai lived after. So they lived after the Churban, and they're arguing how to light the candles. But that's 200 years after the story of Nes Hanukkah. So how could it be machlokes? What did they do the first year? What did they tell people to do? Light 1, 2, 3, 8, 7, 6. What did they tell people? Elo Yeshloimer, that actually they didn't light. They didn't light a Pesach Beis Hamikdash. They didn't light a candle. Why didn't they light a candle in their house? Because they didn't light a candle in their house because the Beis Hamikdash had the candle. There was Ner Hanukkah. There was a Ner Hamikdash. How could a person light a Ner in their own home when there's no Ner Hamikdash? But when you went into Bava, went into Golus, so then we say that the Beis Hamikdash Taka in Yerushalayim we don't have, but we do have a Beis Hamikdash. What's the Beis Hamikdash? Our homes. Our homes is a chelik of the Beis Hamikdash with l'asalavi. Our homes is gufa mamash a chelik of the l'asalavi. So what do we do in our homes? We light the menorah, and where are we going to light the menorah? Dafke in the place where the home is marked as a home, where it's transformed from just a bias that's a container to a space that becomes a home. And where's that place? Dafke in the Dallas. Al Pesach Basin Bachutz. Because we're showing that what is the definition of a home is not just a structure. In order for our home to actually be a lichtige home, a home that's filled with light, a home that's filled with warmth, a home filled with dusha, that our home actually should be a chelik of the regular Tamadoi until the lowest levels of the Golem should be tichlets with completely destroyed. We're going to bring all the light into this world. So we don't, jump out into the world and say we're not protected, we don't have any shmir. Yes, we have a shmir, we have a bias, or a place that's sneers. We have a makom that we're contained, but then in that place we say that where is the ikar bias? The ikar bias, where it becomes a tzura of a true bias, is dafka in the place where is the dalsos, is the place with the doors, where things are open and transit, where we can machnis orchim and we can bring people in from the outside, and we can enjoy other people's company and bring them truly into our homes. They should feel comfortable in our homes with akbalas, and we should project outward all the oil that we're bringing into our homes. We should project outward. So that way the bias that becomes a chelik of the Beis Hamikdash is dafka in the place where there is the dalsas. And that's why we talk like the Hanukkah is ner ishu Beis Soy, and we're dafka Beis Soy. Dafka in the place of the dallas. And if you can't do a dallas, then you can light by the chaloim, because it's a shemetz of the same idea. It's a remez of the same idea of projecting our light from the inside of the house, projecting it outwards. So it's not just moving outwards, but also moving inwards. And this is this continuous fluid relationship with the world around us in a healthy and holy and constructive way. This is be'erech, the inyan of Bayis. And now we'll take a few shilas. So Jeremy, if the Elamah shot, you can ask shilas. So maybe they should ask it loud so we can hear it.
Yeah, perfect. What people can do is, people can either use the raise hand function or message me, and I'll we have questions past when the time or something like that.
Okay. Yeah, Avram.
This is all in Hanukkah. What's about mezuzah?
Same idea. That's what I'm trying to say. This is mezuzah, the same thing. So mezuzah is an interesting.
Isn't the dira, the Dorim of the dira of mezuzah different on Hanukkah?
Yeah, but I'm saying, but where's that? But where do you put the mark of a Yiddish home on the dalsets? You definitely put it in the dalsets. And I was thinking also that it's an interesting thing because it's the why do you put? You know why you put the mezuzah sideways, like turned? Because the is machlokes between the Rishonim, the Rambam, and the Tam is machlokes the Rishonim. How you're supposed to put the mezuzah? You have to put the mezuzah straight up, or you have to put it horizontal or vertical. So we paskin like both. The Santa Halach, we paskin like both. That you do it both. I was thinking also that idea of paskin like, well, besides that, shalom bias, of course. So that's obviously we want to do that. The house should have the premise of the house. When you walk into the home, you should recognize the idea of the shalom of the home. Is also the concept is that the mezuzah is actually tilted. So sort of it's like moving outside in and inside out. So if you have it flat, there's no hagbalas. Inside, outside, outside, inside, there's no hagbalas. You have it straight up, there's a straight door, and there's no connection between the outside and inside. When you have it a little slanted, you're saying things can move from the outside in, from the outside and the outside inside out. But it has to be with the proper gedarim. So it's a bias, but it's for Ratziyam okay, it's fine on that. It's nachal bli mitzarim. It's tafka bias. It is a structure, and it has gidr bias, but it's a place that's open and it's fluid. Yeah.
Thank you, Rav Pinson, so much for the share. I've been sitting with this question actually since the Yayin Kolel. Came across the Bayis Yayin, and in the Kolel we were discussing Yayin being very connected with Sodei Torah, the Yayin Shomer.
Yeah.
And in the learning tonight from the Marash, we're discussing also Bayis connected to this Makif Haracho, which is also seems to be connected with Pneumius Akadosh. So I was wondering if the Rebbe could expand upon this idea of the connection between Bayis, Yayin, what this has to do. I know it may be connected to Har Sinai, but if the Rebbe can help deeper into that.
Yeah, there's a lot of big masagim, but I would just say that in general the idea of Makif Harochik, what is the idea of Makif Harochik? That generally makifim, we think the idea of makifim in a home, when a person's in their home, that they're able to mispash it. Their fullness of their self is in their spashes. There's not, when you're wearing a garment, there's a certain way you're projecting yourself into the outside world. People identify with what you're wearing. If you're wearing a police uniform, people usually think you're a police officer. This is the way sometimes you project yourself in those levushim. But in the higher place where you don't even need the levushim, it could be these spashes. Now there's different types of places. Of course, yayin, Beis Yayin is another place that brings out even a higher level of side. The Beis Yayin, which is talked about in some of the Rishonim, there's a Rambam Pirush Mishnayos. There used to be also a place in Andalus in Spain that they used to have like a Beis Yayin where they would sing poetry together. And some of the Rishonim were for it, against it. The Rambamites against it, obviously, but there was a lot of some of the Rishonim. I think that as some of them were actually composed a lot of their high level of piyutim in these Beis Yayins. So.
Is it possible, like the yayin brings out the pneumius to the foot, it's the same with the light that goes out to the foot, no?
Yeah, the same idea. That's the Nikudah. Nikudah is it's moving out. It's moving outwards. Yeah, it's Surah and Chomer. Yeah, it's not Chomer. Yeah, you can call it. Surah is like the I think the best word is difference between in English, it's the difference between a house and a home. What makes a home is not a house. A house is a structure. You can have a house that you can put your clothes in. It could be like a little box. You can call it a little house, a dog house. I don't know what you call it, a house. But normally something become a dira. It's surah of a real space, not just a house. It needs that delis, that open. It's not just the delis. It's a surah of the whole mezuzah, the mashkuf. It's a place where people walk in and out. That's interesting. That's like the place where the Eibusha tells us that's where we mark our homes. The first time the Eibusha gave us a home and said this is a Yiddish home, we have to mark it on our mezuzah. And that's the place where it's marked. The Jewish home is marked by that space.
Rav Pinson, I have a question. Oh, am I going through?
Yeah, I hear you.
Oh. So I was thinking about the Delet and the Petach being kind of the Ikar of Bayit, but there was a Hanukkah shir where we were talking about the status of the wall of the Beit HaMikdash, or maybe the Kotel, and sticking your finger in the Kotel, and whether there's
Bias Mitzvot, Bias Kolel.
in the wall. I don't know whether there's halachas there's like almost like a suffix, makom suffix about that door step. I don't even know what halachas would
There's a whole thing of Pi Pesach Yerev V'Soisim. There's a sugi in Shas about this. If Pi Pesach Yerev V'Soisim, if like the top of the wall where it's Pi Pesach is actually closes, but that little space of the Pesach actually in Gemara and Erevin talks a lot about this place. Like in that space, Pi Pesach is actually closes, but that little space of the Pesach actually in Gemara and Erevin talks a lot about this place. Like in that space between, you put a lechi and a koira, so you put like beams, right? To mark the space so you can carry inside there. And now how about in between those spaces? Like where the place is marked. Is that considered like on the inside or the outside?
Right, for carrying.
For carrying. So that's a good gather. That's a true place, yes. That's the place where we encounter the inside and the outside. So somehow in halacha, there's actually a big debate. There's like different opinions about that.
Yeah, so I was just, that might connect to to this whole idea, and the menorah being there, and the mezuzah being there,
Correct.
That being the ikar of the bayit.
Correct.
And ichnas and the yotzi, that there's like it's the zone where it's where the projection out happens and the injection in, and
Correct.
so at that point, it's the cups. It's
Correct.
actually unclear what is
Correct.
there.
Correct. And that's what I'm saying. It's a place that there's a relationship both ways. It's not just a place that you're walking out, and it's not just a place that people are coming in. There's the Yotzev and Nichnas. Everyone is contributing in this relationship. When you're machnas oirach, you're not just doing a person the favor that you're giving them food. You're actually also, you're makabel from them. If you're machnas oirach, it's gedolim hakabolos bnei hashchina. There's a kabolos bnei hashchina when you're, it's even bigger than kabolos bnei hashchina, but that's kabolos bnei hashchina according to Baal Shem. That when you're machnas oirach, that's kabolos bnei hashchina. When you're actually machnas oirach, bringing them into your home, so you're bringing that into your space. So that, I guess I'm saying that the Delis is the place where all the magic of just a simple structure of just a container becomes a dira, becomes a tzura of a Yiddish home, or any home. But really, what we're talking about is the Yiddish home. That's where the kedusha lies. That's where it becomes a part of the Beis Hamikdash. That it becomes something sacred, because it's not just I'm boxed into this place. I don't know who said this phrase, but a house is man's fortress. It's like every person is a king in their own castle. Whatever these type of language, it's basically saying it's like I'm protected from the outside. No one can get to me. That's not a very Yiddish thing. Yes, of course we have to protect ourselves, but the way we have to live with the world is that we also have to bring in the world and affect the world, and that happens at the place of the Delis, and that's why the beis tefillah yikar l'cholam. It's a Bayis and it's a place, but it's Dvir B'Secher. You're going to come talk to me, I'm going to come talk to you. And it's going to be a Kolel, but it is a space. It's a very particular contained space.